The most dangerous thing anyone ever says about compound interest is not that it is fake. The most dangerous thing they say is that it is enough. That is where I want to begin. Because compound interest is real. It works. It is not a scam. It is not some cartoon math trick invented by people selling courses and index funds to the naive. The arithmetic is honest. The problem is that the human experience of the arithmetic is often wildly misunderstood. And when people misunderstand it, they make one of the costliest mistakes in modern finance. They begin too small, wait too long, see too little, and conclude too early that the whole thing has been oversold. That is the real danger, not that compounding does not work. That it works invisibly for so long that people quit before it ever becomes powerful enough to change their lives. I have watched versions of this happen for decades. A young man listens to all the proper advice. Start early. Be consistent. Let time do the work. He puts a little money away every month. He tells himself he is becoming responsible. Then he looks at the account after a year or two and feels insulted. The market did its thing. The percentage return happened. The number went up, and still the result feels emotionally irrelevant. He earned a few dollars, then a few more, then a few more. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a darker sentence begins forming. This cannot be it. That sentence ruins a great many futures. Because once a person begins suspecting that compounding is overhyped, the temptation arrives immediately. Chase higher returns, take bigger risk. Jump into crypto, trade options, look for some explosive shortcut. Do something that feels like movement because the dull arithmetic of patient investing has not yet become visible enough to satisfy the ego. That is the whole trap. People do not usually abandon compounding because the math fails. They abandon it because the math is too slow to flatter them during the exact years when patience matters most. That is why I say the problem is not compound interest. The problem is size. The problem is phase. The problem is that nobody explains clearly enough that compounding has a visibility threshold below that threshold. It may be working perfectly and still feel useless. That distinction matters enormously because if something works in theory but feels meaningless for 10 years, most human beings will not stay in the game long enough to see the theory become real. And if they do not stay in the game, then the theory may as well have been false for them. That is the first hard truth. There is a minimum emotional size below which compound interest does almost nothing for the average person's behavior. Now let me be careful here. I am not saying small amounts are worthless. I am not saying $10 a month is pointless. I am not saying $50 a month should be mocked. Every contribution matters, every habit matters, every act of disciplined ownership matters. What I am saying is harsher and more useful than that. There is a difference between something being mathematically valid and financially transformative. A person can invest $50 a month for years and absolutely improve his position relative to someone who invests nothing. That is true. But a person investing $50 a month may also spend the first decade living in a psychological desert where the gains are so small that they do not feel like proof of anything. That is what gets people killed in phase one. They do not lose because the market betrayed them. They lose because the market did not flatter them fast enough. This is why I have always preferred truth to encouragement in money. Encouragement has a place. Truth matters more. If the early phase is going to feel invisible, tell people that if the first few years are mostly a contribution story rather than a compounding story, tell people that if the size of the pile matters more than the elegance of the percentage when you are starting from almost nothing, tell people that too. Because once a person knows what phase he is actually in, he stops treating normal early frustration like evidence that the whole machine is broken. That changes everything. Now let us talk numbers because this is where the fog usually lifts. Suppose you put $50 into an index fund and the market gives you 8% over the year. What do you make on that $50 in year one? $4. That is not a typo, $4. That is mathematically correct, and it is emotionally absurd. No normal human being looks at $4 and says, "Ah, yes, the great machine of wealth has begun." Number he thinks, "I spent more than this on coffee while checking the account." That is the insult built into the early phase compounding may be happening. The result is too small to command respect. This is the first mechanism. I call it invisible output. A system can be working correctly while the output is still too weak to alter behavior. That is the whole challenge of early investing. The machine is on. The lights are just too dim for the human mind to believe it. Now stretch the math out. $50 a month at 8%. After 5 years, the total value is only a few $1,000s after 10 years, still not enough to make a normal adult feel that the engine has changed his life after 20 years, meaningful perhaps, but not enough to retire on. After 30 years, perhaps around $70,000 if the assumptions hold. Real money, certainly not meaningless, but hardly the grand liberation people imagine when they hear the phrase compound interest. This is why I say the phrase is half true and half misleading. Compounding is powerful. What most people call powerful, however, is often really the combination of time plus a sufficiently large input. And if the input is too small, the emotional experience for the first 10 or 15 years is almost identical to stagnation. That is what people were not told. They were told, start small and be consistent. Fine, but they were not told that if small stays too small for too long, compounding remains mostly background noise while contributions do nearly all the visible work. That is the real issue. Now let us move to $200 a month. Same market, same 8%, same time horizon. Suddenly, over 30 years, the outcome starts looking very different. Not because the return changed, because the contribution changed. That is what people keep missing. The interest rate feels like the glamorous variable. It is not in the beginning. The monthly contribution is the dominant force. If you invest $200 a month instead of $50, the account does not become 4 times more emotionally meaningful in a smooth, linear way. It becomes a different experience altogether because the pile reaches useful size much sooner. At $400 a month, the story changes again. At $1,000 a month, it changes violently. Not because the market became smarter, because the pile got big enough fast enough for the percentage to finally matter. This is the second mechanism. I call it contribution dominance. Most financial content worships return rates because return rates sound intelligent. They flatter the speaker. They make him sound like he has discovered some hidden law of wealth. In reality, when the starting balance is small, the return rate often matters much less than the amount being fed into the machine every month. That is not a philosophical opinion. It is arithmetic. An 8% return on almost nothing is still almost nothing. A 15% return on almost nothing is slightly more than almost nothing. People hear higher return and imagine a totally different future. Then they run the numbers honestly and discover something humiliating. A much higher return on a tiny base often does far less than a simple increase in monthly contribution. This is why early investors so often get seduced into the wrong kind of risk. They look at their returns and feel disappointed. Then they decide the answer must be more aggressive assets, smaller stocks, speculative technology, crypto options, leverage bets, whatever promises more speed. But what they often needed was not more volatility. They needed a bigger input. That is the mistake. Now, to show you how cruel this misunderstanding can be, consider the difference between trying to earn 16% on $200 a month versus just contributing more money into a plain old 8% broad index strategy. The dramatic return chase sounds smarter. It sounds more advanced. It sounds like the person is serious. In practice, a higher monthly contribution at an ordinary long-term return often beats the high return fantasy, especially over the first decade, and does so with far less danger that matters. Because the people who destroy themselves financially are not always the lazy ones. They are often the impatient ones. They cannot tolerate phase 1, so they try to force phase 2 with risk. That is like trying to yank a tree upward by the trunk because you are annoyed at how long roots take. It does not work. Now let us name the threshold properly. Where does compounding stop being mostly invisible and start becoming something you can actually feel? The answer is not mystical. It is not the same for every person. But it tends to show up once the invested balance reaches roughly $100,000 to $150,000. That is where the emotional physics change. At $100,000, an 8% annual return is $8,000 a year. Now we are talking, now the money is doing something, now the account can produce $600+ a month in average annualized terms without any new contribution at all. That is when compounding stops being an idea and starts becoming an event. That is when people open the statement and finally understand what the old men were talking about, because now the portfolio is no longer whispering. Now it is speaking. This is the third mechanism, I call it, the first real threshold. The first real threshold is not millionaire status. That comes much later and gets all the attention because it sounds glamorous. The first real threshold is the point where the account begins generating enough on its own that your contributions no longer feel like the sole engine of progress. That threshold is psychologically more important than the millionaire line for most people, because at that point the relationship between you and the portfolio changes. Before the threshold, you are dragging the machine uphill. After the threshold, the machine begins helping you push. That is the moment investors remember for the rest of their lives. Now, to understand why this matters so much, you have to separate the wealth-building journey into two phases. Almost nobody does this clearly enough. They talk about investing as though it were one long continuous activity. It is not. Phase 1 is the contribution phase. This is the grunt work. This is where you are the engine. Your income, your savings rate, your discipline, your willingness to say no, your ability to redirect money, your capacity to keep contributing when nothing exciting is happening. That is what builds the pile. The market is helping, yes, but only a little. The market is a small bonus attached to your behavior. That is phase 1. Phase 2 is the compounding phase. This is where the pile becomes large enough that the market S percentage starts creating real numbers. Now the machine has weight. Now the growth begins arriving not only because you keep feeding the account, but because the account has become large enough to throw off meaningful gains by itself. That is a different world. The tragedy is that almost all the glamour people associate with compound interest belongs to phase 2, but all the discipline required to reach phase 2 is demanded in phase 1. And phase 1 is not glamorous at all. That is why so many people fail there. This is the fourth mechanism. I call it delayed emotional reward. Humans are not built to keep doing something that feels invisible for a decade without some clear understanding of what is being built beneath the surface. If no one explains the phases, people interpret the early invisibility as failure. They do not say, "I am still in contribution mode." They say, "This is not working." That misunderstanding is devastating because phase 1 is not where you are supposed to feel rich. It is where you are supposed to build the pile that later makes richness possible. This is exactly why social media creates such a poisonous environment for investing. Social media shows people the end state, big accounts, large passive returns, quarterly statements with gains that exceed a normal paycheck. People see the visible result and think the owner of the account must have some secret strategy. Usually the secret is older and more boring, a larger pile, a longer runway, a higher contribution history. A decade that nobody posted about because nobody posts about the years when the process feels stupid and slow. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it survivorship display. You are seeing what compounding looks like after the threshold and comparing it to your own position before the threshold. That comparison is emotionally fatal if you do not understand the phases. You are not behind because your statement looks small in year 3. You are in phase 1. That is all. Now, once you understand the phases, the strategy gets much simpler. Stop worshiping return rates in the early years. Start worshiping contribution growth. That is the real game. Not because return is irrelevant forever. It is not. Because in phase 1, contribution growth does more work than return optimization for almost everyone. That means your real questions change. Not, how do I get 15% instead of 8%? That is usually the wrong question. The right questions are colder and more useful. How do I increase my monthly contribution by $50? How do I increase it by $100? How do I keep half of every raise from disappearing into lifestyle? How do I treat investing like a fixed bill rather than an emotional leftover? How do I get more of my own labor flowing into future ownership rather than current leakage? Those questions matter because a person who increases his contribution from $200 to $300 and then $400 and then $500 a month often outruns the person who kept chasing exotic returns on a weak base. That is the sixth mechanism, I call it. Input beats ambition. A lot of people want their portfolio to rescue them from their life structure. It cannot. If your income is weak, your spending is undisciplined, and your monthly contribution is an afterthought, then no beautiful theory of compound interest is going to turn that into a powerful machine quickly enough to matter. You do not need portfolio magic. You need a bigger hose feeding the reservoir. That is what nobody wants to hear because it shifts the work back onto behavior, career, expenses, and discipline. Those things are not cinematic. They do not let you imagine that you are one hot stock away from acceleration, but they are real. That is why I would tell any young investor the following. In the early years, your greatest investment is not your ability to pick assets. It is your ability to enlarge your monthly contribution without destroying the rest of your life. That may come from earning more. That may come from spending less. That may come from selling things you do not need. That may come from side work, better negotiation, skill building, or simply refusing lifestyle inflation every time income rises. All of those are investing decisions in disguise, and in phase one they matter more than people realize. Now, let us go deeper into the psychology, because this is where most plans really fail. A person looks at his monthly investment contribution and treats it like an optional act of goodness. If there is anything left at the end of the month, he will contribute. That sounds harmless. It is not. What is left at the end of the month is almost always nothing, because modern life is exquisitely designed to absorb every unclaimed dollar. The money goes to food, then entertainment, then convenience, then upgrades, then subscriptions, then little emotional purchases, then a deserved treat, then a social obligation, then nothing remains, so the contribution never happens. This is why I've always believed that the investment contribution must be treated like a fixed bill. Not the thing you do if the month was generous, the thing you do first so the future has a claim before the world spends everything else on your behalf. This is the seventh mechanism. I call it paying your future before your feelings. The best way to increase contribution consistency is to remove the daily argument from your mind. Automate it. Set the transfer on payday. Let the money leave before your emotions can negotiate with it. If the money sits in checking beside your desires, the desires usually win. This is not a statement about morality. It is a statement about environment. People spend what they can see. They protect what has already moved. That is why automatic transfers change lives. They are not sophisticated. They are disciplined. And discipline is what phase one needs most. Now let me say something else that matters greatly. A small increase repeated over many years can change the entire arc of compounding. People dismiss $50 because $50 feels small. That is an emotional mistake. $50 a month added to a long runway at a reasonable return becomes tens of thousands of dollars. Add another 50 later, then another, then another. Now the contribution itself begins compounding upward as your own discipline scales. That is an underappreciated form of compounding. People think only the investments compound. Behavior compounds too. A person who gets slightly better every year at feeding the machine is doing something much more powerful than he realizes. This is the eighth mechanism. I call it contribution compounding. The amount you invest each month does not need to be fixed forever. In fact, if it remains fixed forever while your income grows, you are probably letting lifestyle steal what should have become future strength. The smartest move most ordinary investors can make is simple. With every raise, every improvement, every extra income source, route part of it automatically toward ownership before your spending habits absorb it. That is how a $200 contribution becomes a $500 contribution without feeling like one violent self-denial. Now the threshold arrives sooner. Now phase two appears faster. Now compounding starts feeling real years earlier than it otherwise would have. That is why I say the early years are not about genius. They are about volume, more money in, more months in the game, more behavior aligned with future ownership. That is what creates the base. Without the base, the return rate is mostly decoration. Now, let us address one more dangerous misunderstanding. Some people, after hearing all this, conclude that compounding is therefore overrated. That is the wrong lesson. Compounding is not overrated. Compounding is delayed. People want it too soon. They want phase two magic in a phase one account. That is the error. The machine is not failing. The operator is expecting the wrong thing from the wrong stage. Once you understand that, patience becomes easier because it is now informed patience. You are not waiting blindly. You are building toward the threshold intentionally. That is a huge psychological difference. The man who thinks nothing is happening tends to quit. The man who knows he is still below the threshold keeps going because he understands the work still being done is foundational. This is the ninth mechanism. I call it threshold awareness. Threshold awareness gives meaning to invisible years. It tells you why the first decade may feel quiet. It tells you what the target really is. It tells you that the right goal in phase one is not to feel rich. It is to reach the size where compounding stops whispering. That is the real objective, not millionaire fantasies, not passive income vanity, not screenshots. Reach the size where the account starts doing work you can feel. Once you get there, everything changes. Returns begin to outgrow the monthly contribution. The account starts having momentum of its own. Bad months feel less fatal. The whole relationship with investing becomes less like discipline and more like partnership. That is when people finally understand why the old advice was not false, just incomplete. Now let me bring this home. If you are investing $50 a month, do not laugh at yourself and do not romanticize it either. Tell the truth. You are in a very long game. If you can increase it, increase it. If you cannot yet, then at least understand the phase you are in so you do not quit out of misunderstanding. If you are investing $200 to $500 a month, now you are in the zone where a decade of seriousness can begin creating a base that matters. Protect that phase ruthlessly. If you are investing $1,000 or more each month, now the threshold can arrive much sooner and the entire shape of your financial life may change within 10 years. That matters. But in all three cases, the same principle holds. Do not chase a miraculous return on a tiny pile when what you really need is a larger pile. Do not ask phase 1 to feel like phase 2. Do not confuse invisible growth with broken math. And do not let the boredom of early compounding trick you into abandoning. The only machine that, once large enough, can genuinely start working while you sleep. That is the final point. Compound interest is not useless. What is useless is expecting it to transform your life while you keep feeding it too little to become visible. In any reasonable time frame, that is the truth people are afraid to say because it sounds harsh. I do not think it is harsh. I think it is respectful of arithmetic. Respectful of time, respectful of the human mind, which needs real milestones, not vague encouragement if it is going to stay disciplined for 20 or 30 years. So if you want one sentence to remember this. Compound interest is not the strategy. Contribution growth is the strategy. Compound interest is the reward that arrives after you have built enough size for the math to finally matter. Understand that, and you stop feeling betrayed by the early years. You start using them properly. And that may be the difference between someone who dabbles in investing for a while and someone who actually builds a life around ownership long enough for the future to begin carrying some of the load. That is the real gameplay, that game. And the invisible years stop feeling pointless. They start feeling necessary. And once that shift happens, you are far more likely to stay in the chair long enough for compounding to do what it always promised. But only after you had the patience and the size to let it speak.